Before this story even begins, let me ask you something honestly. Have you ever been so lonely that a single moment, a single glance, a single presence in the room made you question everything you believed you were strong enough to resist? Because tonight's story is not about desire alone. It's about silence. It's about grief that never healed. And it's about how easily the heart can wander when it's been starving for warmth for far too long. So before we go any further, if you're drawn to real stories that unfold slowly, painfully, and truthfully, stories that don't rush the truth but let it breathe, then take a second right now. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. Because stories like this don't just entertain, they stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Now, let me take you back to the night everything quietly began. It was well past midnight. One of those nights where sleep refuses to come no matter how still you lie, no matter how tightly you close your eyes. I had been turning from one side of the bed to the other for hours, listening to the ticking of the clock, feeling every second stretch longer than the last. Eventually, I gave up. I rose slowly, careful not to make noise, and stepped into the hallway, intending only to fetch a glass of water. Nothing more. Just water. Something to calm the dryness in my throat that always came when my thoughts grew too heavy. The lights in the living room were still on. That alone gave me pause. The soft glow spilled into the hallway like a quiet reminder of why the house felt different that night. Why the air itself seemed unsettled. My brother Casey. Earlier that evening, he had called me, his voice strained, exhausted, cracked in places he tried to hide. He had asked me to take in his son, Paul, for a while, just until things settled, just until the chaos stopped shaking his world apart. Paul's wife had betrayed him, not in a small way, not in a forgivable way. Years of devotion had collapsed overnight, leaving him blindsided, humiliated, and emotionally wrecked. Casey said Paul hadn't been sleeping, had barely been eating, and the worst part, he couldn't even process it yet. He was still stuck in disbelief, replaying moments, searching for signs he missed. Please, Casey had said, he needs peace, even if it's just for a little while. I didn't know Paul well, not really. He was my nephew, yes, but life has a way of scattering families into distant orbits. Still, I understood pain like his. Too well. Our family had already endured more loss than it deserved. And this felt like another crack forming in an already fragile foundation. 7 years ago, I lost my husband, Jacob. One moment we were planning, dreaming, arguing over paint colors and kitchen layouts for the home we were building together. A future we believed was certain. The next moment, he was gone. A sudden heart attack. No warning. No goodbye. At 60 years old, I became a widow overnight. The house we were meant to grow old in never became a home. And the life I thought I understood vanished just as abruptly. Since then, loneliness had been my constant companion. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that whispers, that sits beside you at breakfast, that follows you into empty rooms, that grows heavier at night. And tonight, it felt unbearable. As I stepped into the living room, I saw Paul sitting on the couch, eyes fixed on the television. A romantic movie played silently, the kind I hadn't watched in years. The kind that used to mean something before life taught me how temporary love could be. My first thought wasn't about myself. It was about him. All I wanted was for Paul to feel some calm while he stayed here. A place where nothing was expected of him, where he didn't have to explain his pain or justify his grief. I had no idea then that life had other plans. Sometimes it only takes one step, one moment, one choice that feels harmless. Paul looked up when he noticed me. "Did I wake you?" he asked. His voice was quiet, gentle. But there was something underneath it. Uncertainty mixed with exhaustion. Like a man trying to sound normal while holding himself together by force. I stood there in my nightgown, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt. The fabric, the late hour, the stillness of the house, it all felt strangely intimate. "No," I said, offering a small smile. "I just came for some water." That was the truth. But it wasn't the whole truth. What I didn't say was how overwhelming the loneliness felt in that moment. How the idea of returning to my empty bedroom made my chest ache. I wasn't ready for the night to end. Paul hesitated, then gestured toward the empty space beside him. "Come sit," he said softly. "Let's finish the movie together." The invitation felt innocent. And yet, something inside me stirred. I told myself it was nothing. Just company. Just two people trying not to feel alone. So I sat down. The couch dipped slightly beneath my weight. The movie continued, but my attention drifted. Paul's presence felt louder than the sound coming from the television. His nearness made the room feel smaller, warmer, charged in a way I hadn't felt in years. As the characters on screen leaned toward one another, memories I thought I had buried long ago resurfaced. Moments of closeness, of being wanted, of belonging to someone. I shifted, uncomfortable with the direction of my thoughts. That's when it happened. My arm brushed against his. It was accidental, completely unintentional. But the contact sent a sharp jolt through me. I pulled back instantly. "I'm sorry," I blurted out, heat rushing to my face. Paul paused, then nodded gently. "It's okay," he said. "Really." But the space between us had changed. The movie kept playing, but neither of us was watching anymore. There was no peace in that room, only two people sitting side by side, each painfully aware of their own emptiness. That night would stay with me forever. Because it wasn't the moment something happened. It was the moment something began. A quiet shift. A subtle crossing of a line that hadn't yet been named. When the movie ended, I stood quickly. "I'm going to bed," I said, needing distance more than sleep. In my room, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts refused to settle. I wasn't sure what I was trying to understand, but I knew something inside me had been awakened. Morning came without rest. I wandered to the piano, the one thing that had brought me comfort since Jacob's death. For 7 years, those keys had been my refuge. My way of speaking to a world that no longer listened. As my fingers moved, the music filled the house. Then I felt it. Someone watching. I looked up and saw Paul standing quietly nearby, listening as if the world had narrowed to that single sound. When I finished, he smiled. "Thank you," he said. "That's the best birthday gift I've ever received." I blinked. Birthday? I turned 40 today. Something shifted inside me, and I didn't yet realize this was only the beginning. When Paul said it was his birthday, something inside me tightened. 40. The number echoed louder than it should have. Not because of age, but because of what it represented. A man standing at the edge of a life that had just collapsed. A man who didn't know yet how to rebuild himself. And somehow, standing there in my living room, I felt dangerously close to becoming part of that rebuilding process. I smiled, trying to keep things light. "Well," I said, forcing a small laugh. "I didn't know. I would have at least baked a cake." He shrugged gently. Just hearing that was enough. And that's what scared me, because his words didn't feel like politeness. They felt sincere, grateful. As if something as simple as music, something I had taken for granted, had touched a part of him that was still raw and exposed. For the rest of that morning, an unspoken awareness hung between us. We moved around the house carefully, politely, like two people afraid of disturbing something fragile. Every glance lingered half a second too long. Every silence felt heavier than conversation. By afternoon, I found myself thinking about his birthday more than I should have. I told myself it was nothing. Just kindness. Just hospitality. Just doing what any decent person would do for family. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. Loneliness has a way of disguising itself as generosity. When I finally spoke, it was almost without thinking. "It's your birthday," I said. "We should do something. Wine. Maybe a small cake." Paul looked surprised, then amused. "Well," he said slowly, "if you insist, I suppose I won't say no." Then, with a faint smile that made my stomach twist, he added, "But only if you promise to play the piano again tonight." I laughed, trying to shake off the sudden nervous flutter in my chest. Fine, I said, but only if it's good wine. The way he looked at me then, warm, appreciative, almost relieved, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And that was the problem. By evening, the house felt different. Candles flickered softly on the table. The wine glasses clinked gently as we toasted. Not to birthdays, not to the past, but to getting through difficult days. Conversation flowed easily. Too easily. Paul talked about his marriage, not with bitterness but with quiet disbelief. He spoke about how betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it slips in silently, disguised as routine. I listened. I understood more than I wanted to admit. At one point, he looked at me and asked casually, "How old are you?" I paused. People always guessed younger. I had grown used to deflecting the question. "Not 45, I said lightly. He smiled. I didn't think so. Something warm and dangerous spread through me. By the time I sat at the piano again, the wine had softened the edges of my restraint. My fingers moved instinctively, guided by emotion rather than intention. The music filled the room, slow and aching, carrying years of grief I had never fully released. I didn't realize when I stopped playing. I only realized when I felt his hands gently cover mine. I froze. "You're incredible," Paul said quietly. "Not just your music. You." The room seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment. The moment where loneliness demanded an answer. For a split second I considered letting it happen. Letting the warmth replace the emptiness. Letting myself forget the rules I had lived by for 7 years. But then, Jacob's face surfaced in my mind. Not as a ghost, not as guilt, but as a reminder. I gently pulled my hands away. "No," I said softly, but firmly. Paul stepped back immediately. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean—" "I know," I interrupted. "And that's why this has to stop now." Silence fell between us. Pain flickered across his face. Not rejection, but understanding. "I don't want to be another mistake in someone else's healing," I continued. "And I don't want you to confuse kindness with something that would only hurt us both later." He nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. I just didn't want to feel broken anymore." "Neither did I admitted. That night, we said goodnight earlier than usual. No lingering looks, no accidental touches, just two people choosing restraint over regret. A few days later, Paul left. He hugged me at the door, not tightly, not desperately, but with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me I'm still human." When the door closed behind him, the house returned to its silence. But this time, it felt different. Not empty, just quiet. Weeks passed, then months. I returned to my routines, my piano, my mornings, my solitude. But something had shifted. I had looked temptation in the eye and chosen myself. And that choice stayed with me. Because loneliness doesn't mean you are entitled to another person's heart. And healing doesn't begin by crossing lines you can't uncross. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away from something that feels good because you know it won't end well. And that night, that moment I stopped. That was the night I truly learned the difference between desire and dignity.